tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
So it is not actually fair to say that you can say whatever you want, wherever you want, whenever you want in Canada. And again, some people may agree with that. You may say, well, that's a reasonable restriction. We're not debating reasonableness. It is a restriction on free speech. Anything after that is a matter of degrees, which is why I do take things like what the CRTC is doing very seriously. This is a body which has existed throughout its history to regulate airwaves, which are a public good. There's only a finite amount of radio frequencies, of television frequencies. And I get that you need a regulator, a bureaucracy to start divvying that up. And I get that you need to have some compliance, especially on technical issues. The United Kingdom is a great example of what happens when you start adding a much more aggressive and content-focused mandate to their telecom regulator. Ofcom, as it exists in the US, does in fact regulate content. The CRTC does not. And that has not directly changed under C11, but we're seeing a creep in that direction when they start talking about all of these qualitative things that we need more of, beyond even simply Canadian content, but specific forms, showcasing diversity, all of that. There is a lot to take issue with in this bill. I want to welcome to the program here Peter Menzies. He is a former vice chair of the CRTC. Peter, it is always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Let me just go back to that distinction between Canada and the UK here. Has there been an active push within the CRTC to try to have a more expansive mandate on content historically?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, expansive mandate on content. They do regulate content. The CRTC does that. It's through conditions of license. And it's done, transactionally. As you were saying, as I caught the end of what you were saying, that's fair. It's the spectrum is a crown asset. It's a limited resource. The state has every right to decide how it's used on behalf of Canadians. And when people apply for a license, they accept certain terms and conditions. And one of those is that they will conduct themselves in a certain way on air and comply with things like the Code of Conduct for the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, which at the end of the day can be appealed to the CRTC. So the CRTC has tried to keep a long arm on that content regulation, but it is there because the Broadcasting Act compels it to make sure that the system is, to use its terms, I believe it's high standard, which is about as subjective as you can get. But
I mean that right there is what I was referring to. In that, in the UK, they don't really have their equivalent with as much power as the Broadcast Standards Council, which I think has probably helped the CRTC keep its nose clean on really getting into the nitty gritty for a lot of these large broadcasters. And then you bring this into an internet context, and we're taking this regulatory authority and putting it over what has been a space that it's not completely unregulated. Laws that exist elsewhere in Canada still exist on the internet, but yes, you don't have that core requirement there of a limited public good that needs to be regulated as such.
Yeah, and that was one of the big problems I found in the last week's decisions by the CRTC was that they were making decisions like about online news organizations, online news, and the other one that caught the eye was pornography or adult content, right? And then the reasoning was that, well, it wouldn't be fair to leave those guys unregulated when the guys within the license system are regulated. And that makes no sense at all to me because, like I was saying, if you're inside the license system, it's a transaction. You get the license, and when you get the license, you also get, you take on these responsibilities and you take on these conditions of license, but you also get protected. There's all kinds of benefits that come with a license. In the unlicensed area, you're going to get the same regulation, but where's your benefit?
Yeah, I think that's a tremendously important question here. And, right now, a lot of the defenders of this are, I think, being very short-sighted. They're talking about effectively, all they're doing is asking for their name and phone number and address. But it's like, okay, to do what with? It's basically to have the point of contact when they start expanding these expectations and requirements, I think. And it's not benign.
No, it's not, and it's funny how people can just shrug that off. All they're asking for is your name and phone number and address, right? If you were walking down the street and an officer of the law came up and asked you your name and phone number and address, right? That's, I mean, I don't want to over exaggerate it, but that's a papers, please society, right? I mean, it really is. I mean, it can sound benign, and it can be benign, but it can also be, a bridge that you don't want to cross, right? Particularly when it's unclear to me as to what the benefit is to society of it occurring, and what.
And just to go back to the limited public good aspect, because not only is there, there are only so many radio stations that you could have conceivably because of the laws of frequencies, but even within radio programming and television you have 24 hours in a day. So I can understand, and I would question whether Canadian content regulations are relevant today, but I could understand, okay, we have this many hours a day, you need to devote a certain aspect of it to Canadian content. The internet is finite, or is infinite, as we were talking about. And by that, if you want to access, Canadian content, you have it available to you. If you want to access American content, if you're an immigrant that wants to access content from your home country or in a foreign language, you have all of that right. And I've yet to hear from the government a compelling reason for how Canadian content is being underserved by the internet.
There isn't really a compelling reason. I mean, we went through this discussion a bit with Bill C11 in terms of that, especially when people were talking about, all we're trying to do is make sure that Canadian content is discoverable on the internet. Well, there's something called a search tool, right? And all you have to do is open up your Netflix app, go into the search tool and type Canadian or type Canada, and all kinds of stuff comes up, right? So they're not really talking about giving people the ability to discover that. What they're talking about is forcing the discoverability on people, and that means suppressing this discoverability of other people. So you end up with a favored group getting bumped up on your feed online, and the less favored groups getting less exposure. So you'll still be able to be free to do what you want to do, but your ability to find an audience for what you're doing will be impaired because of the government's preference for different types of content over others.
Yeah, I think that's a tremendously important point you raise, because one of the big challenges here is that it is like one's gain has to be at another's loss. If you assume that there's only so much space on the Netflix homepage, on the YouTube homepage, certain content has to be downgraded. And these tech companies, whatever criticisms you may wish to level at them, of which many have come from me, they are pretty attuned to their viewers as businesses. They've invested millions of dollars in fine-tuning the algorithms and what people want and what they're going to respond to. And this bill, by design, is a manipulation of that. And I can't remember, I think it was Pablo Rodriguez a while back when he was still the minister, was saying that, this isn't going to manipulate any algorithms. No, but it's government forcing these companies to manipulate their algorithms.
Yeah, Ian Scott, the past chair of the CRTC, said that exactly. Senator Pamela Wallin asked him, said, well, you're not exactly regulating, but you're regulating through the platforms, right? And he said, yep, that's exactly right. We're not going to tell you what to do with your algorithm. We're just going to tell you the outcome we want, and then we'll talk about how you do that in terms of your licensing. So that's exactly what happened. The sad part about that too is that because we're, YouTube and these other products are global products. If you monkey with those algorithms here, and people don't get the sort of visibility they want within Canada, that has an impact on their opportunity to have visibility in global markets. And the best way for Canadian producers of any kind to make money, like serious money, is to have access to global markets. I mean, there's 120 million Anglophones in India, right? There's 350 million of them just next door. Like you can get an audience of 30 million people in Canada, or you can expand and have access to an audience of 350 million next door, all speaking English, and and we're choosing to build a wall between that to make it more difficult. I mean, I get the idea that you want to promote Canadian content, but there's ways to do that without hurting Canadian content and its global opportunities as an outcome.
Well, I was chatting about this a little yesterday with Chris Sims. I mean, the amusing part of this, I mean, it's not really amusing, I guess, if you think about it, is that the government would, I think, vehemently reject other countries blocking off the import of Canadian content, because I think, the Canadian government would love nothing more than for more Canadian cultural exports, more Schitt's Creeks of the world that will achieve popularity overseas. But if other countries were to do what Canada has done, that would never happen. And you basically become very siloed, where Denmark will have Danish content predominantly and Canada will have Canadian content predominantly. And that really is the very opposite of what the internet has ushered in that is good.
It is. It is exactly the opposite. I mean, and that's the big difference that doesn't seem to have sunk in with the Department of Heritage at all on him. I really worry that they don't seem to understand the internet and the opportunity of it, right? It's like with the Online Streaming Act, I get that there might have been concerns in Quebec about Francophone funding and that sort of stuff in the long run. Okay, but if they need more money, just give them more money. But, the Canadian film and television industry, its last 10 years, it's been just flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
They've had great years. They've had the best years in their history. And even the production of Canadian content is at record high levels. But they still wanted to bring in this regulation because they were worried about Canadian content. The problem is mystical at this stage, right? and you are now risking bringing to an end this decade of incredible prosperity, all because of some political manipulation. Like I said, I think the core issue was probably, Francophone content, that they weren't getting as much funding as was coming through the private sector to Anglophone. I get that. But if they need a leg up and the government wants to help them, just give them more money, right? You don't need to redo the whole internet and create all these problems and all this regulation to fix that problem.
We've seen with Bill C11, the Online News Act, what happens when these big tech companies decide it's not worth their while to comply with legislation. As a result, True North and countless other media outlets in Canada cannot share their content on Facebook. We've heard this week that Google and the government have not really been able to reach any resolution on this. So I don't know whether we're going to see a response like that from any of the players when it comes to streaming. I'm curious if you think any will respond that way. I mean, surely for a Netflix, there's enough of a Canadian market that it's worth complying in some way with this, especially if it doesn't really cost them anything. But do you see some C18 style response from any of the big players?
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible. Not so much necessarily from the big players, although it is possible from, say, a Disney Plus. And, for reasons in addition to this legislation in terms of how they're positioning themselves. But at a certain point, this is interesting for the CRTC because in all of its hearings in the past, it's everybody in the room, pretty much everybody in the room has a CRTC license or wants a CRTC license. They're all dependent on the CRTC. So all that really is happening in the room is you're negotiating the terms of that relationship, but the relationship is locked in. You are married to the CRTC. When it comes to now with this next hearing, there's going to be a whole bunch of people in the room who have the option just to leave. And that creates an entirely new dynamic. And I'm really, really curious to see how the CRTC is going to respond to that, because there'll be people there who can say, well, sure, if you do that, well, then we'll have to look at it from a business point of view. And some of the smaller streamers, particularly, could look at it and say, you know what? I mean, all this regulation and all this sort of stuff, and if we have to make a contribution into this fund and that sort of stuff, there's a Anglophone market of just over 30 million people. It's not that big. It's just not worth it, right? And they'll just leave, and they'll take their most popular shows and they will sell them most likely to Crave. So this will work very well for Bell if that works, because then they'll become an aggregator of all these smaller channels. BritBox, like I mentioned, is one. So I'm not saying nobody can say what will happen because you don't know, but it's certainly possible. And they'll just do a business analysis on it and say, okay, we'll just sell some stuff into Canada, but we don't need to stream in Canada. And so Canadians will have us be living in a smaller world.
Well, it's an interesting dilemma you bring up. I mean, one that I've been trying to sort of goad into this debate is Daily Wire in the US, which operates its own streaming service for content behind a paywall. They've got Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson. It's a more conservative aligned network, obviously, so I don't think it's particularly keen to do Justin Trudeau's bidding. But beyond that, it's an outlet that would have very little interest in the Canadian market, and it's probably not worth their time to focus on compliance with Canadian regulation. So you take the Daily Wire as one example, and there are probably others that you could point to in Australia or the UK or Europe that just do not invest in Canadian government relations or compliance because it's so minuscule to them. And I'm wondering what will happen, because a lot of these organizations may not even think to register. If they do, they may think that it's not worth their while. Does the CRTC even have the capacity right now to start going after any outlet around the world that doesn't register, that under the letter of what they're doing operates in Canada by virtue of being accessible here?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that one out, because I was asking a couple of colleagues this morning in anticipation of being asked that question. How can they find out who makes $10 million in Canada and who doesn't? Mm-hmm. Right? So, like, I mean,
and does it have to be 10 million from Canada, or can it be just 10 million? Because the way I read it, it just said if they have revenues exceeding 10 million. I wasn't even sure if it was geographically limited.
I think that maybe stands to be clarified as well.
Okay.
But I mean,
but even so, how do they know?
How are you going to tell if? I mean, let's just assume that it's $10 million in revenue that you draw from Canada, that you are, because it sort of says you are active in Canada and you have revenues, so it probably needs to be clarified. But let's assume it's $10 million. And how do you find out, right? Like, and who wants to find out? Who wants to sort of, when you don't register, does that mean everybody knows how much money you're not making, right? And that sort of stuff. So I think the 10 million was a real mistake. I think they should have had a much bigger number, in part to make life easier for everybody, at least starting down this path of internet regulation. But secondly, the whole purpose of this act was sold to everybody as this is just about getting money from web giants. So go get money. So what? Now you make $11 million. That makes you a web giant? Like, I don't get that at all. So anyway, I don't know yet how they would find out. Like, if you don't register, how they would find out about you. If they do find out, they have fairly limited powers at this point, but they would have to go to federal court and get a court order forcing your compliance. They've done that. They've done that in the past with other groups that are supposed to register that have refused to register, but they don't have a big hammer they can bring down on you. So this could, that gets immediate action. So this is something that could drag on for years.
Well, and also, I mean, if we are talking about a player that's completely non-compliant for whatever reason, inevitably you have one tool in the toolkit, which is block Canadians from accessing this. The government would have to, and that's a road that I would hope no government wants to go down.
Yeah, you'd end up going to court to get a federal court to issue a blocking order to ISPs.
Yeah,
that says that you may no longer show Andrew Lawton's show. You have to.
Don't give them any ideas, Peter.
You have to.
Don't make 10 million, I promise you.
No, you have to block that, right? Because they are non-compliant and that sort of stuff. And that gets, that is really, really draconian when you have to get into that, right? So I think people's willingness to register, I mean, there will be a number of people who will do so very nervously. And everybody says, well, right now you're just being asked to register and that sort of stuff. But no, you're not. You're being asked. You're being asked to walk through a door, and you don't really know what's on the other side, and that makes people nervous. And it'll have a negative impact on investment. It'll have a negative impact on growth, just as the Facebook ban has had on news has had people put expansion plans and growth plans on hold. Because everybody's right now, it's 2 months. We're 2 months in, and everybody's trying to get the calculator out and trying to figure out how much this has cost them so far, and where are we at it? Where how's this impact our budget for this year? Where do we have to cut back? Do we have to cut back? Can we make it up someplace else? That's what you create. when you do this, and it can go on for years, and it does real harm, especially at a time when we need a lot of creativity, we need a lot of investment, we need to adapt to a new world.
Yeah, very, very well said. Peter Menzies, always a pleasure. Keep up the fantastic work on this. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much for your interest. Always happy to help.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.